So, James, I have some disturbing news, which is that Natural England apparently seem to have taken control of West Sussex.
What, literally, Martin? Like, is this an escalation? Are they like an invading army occupying West Sussex now?
Yes, James, the enemy has been hiding in his strongholds on the South Downs, building up his grand army, and now he's sweeping across the commuter belts. The great towns of Midhurst and Petworth have fallen, the whole of Billingshurst is in his hands, and we must expect another blow to be struck, almost immediately, at Crawley or sorry, I got carried away there, James, but it's pretty serious stuff.
I just want to remind listeners, you aren't imagining things. Winston Churchill is not in the room with us. It sounds exactly like it, but like...
Friend of the pod.
Yeah, friend of the pod, Winston Churchill. So, Martin, what's going on? What do Natural England actually want?
Well, James, they want water for their snails, and whereas Vladimir Putin uses tanks and drones and artillery and thousands of Russian troops to achieve his objectives, Natural England have a much more cunning and sophisticated weapon, which apparently is strongly worded letters.
Okay, Martin, you're going to have to explain this to me. So, what's going on, and why aren't we sending in like the RAF to try and stop them?
So this story comes from Michael Denez, who is a good friend of the pod. He was on a recent episode, and he's got one of those jobs in kind of policy and think tanks, which I can't explain no matter how many times I ask him about it. And roughly once a month, he will post something like a thread on Twitter that will absolutely break your brain. And his most recent post is about a letter that he uncovered, which Natural England sent to Horsham District Council. And it's one of the most extraordinary two-page letters that I think I've ever seen in terms of just grabbing power.
So, Natural England, they're a quango. We've talked about them far too much on this podcast. They're like our regular villain every week. They're the Joker to our Batman. They were involved in the infamous Bat Tunnel. Again, they're the Joker to our Batman, I guess. They've blocked improvements to various roads. They even tried to block their own headquarters from being built. They're basically NIMBY ultras, yet inexplicably a literal part of the government. They're like not just a charity or something. They are part of the government who have to be consulted on nature stuff.
Yeah, essentially a sort of a civil war division of the government that fights the rest of the government. And they don't actually carry weapons unless you class a bat detector as a weapon. But in every other way, they're sort of like a revolutionary brigade of bureaucrats shutting down development on a massive scale across the UK and adding billions of pounds worth of costs to major projects. They're a public body. They're independent of the government, but in theory, they're subject to guidance from the minister in charge of DEFRA. And they were set up in 2006 to bring the powers of various earlier precursor organizations together in one place to protect the environment in a joined-up way. And this means, for example, they can define habitats and species that need protection, they can mark out areas of special scientific interest, and they can effectively set rules for any development that's going to impact those natural areas.
So, that all sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? Like, I think we want to protect the environment. It's good that we protect the environment and think about it in this sort of joined up way.
Yeah, exactly. It is a completely reasonable goal, and it's sort of quite sensible in the same way that creating an AI to run your military defenses is also completely reasonable and sensible. But then somehow you end up with Skynet, and the next thing you know, Robert Patrick's trying to stab you in a steel factory. And malevolent AI is actually a really good analogy for Natural England because essentially the same kind of thing has happened. We've created this intelligent entity with sort of narrowly defined goals that it pursues with almost a religious zealotry, even when it causes considerable harm to people.
So we've got an alignment problem.
I mean, literally.
So I'm curious how this has happened so quickly. So they've taken over West Sussex now. Were they this bad from the start, or did it take time for Natural England to sort of get like this with their iron fist?
So it was almost immediate. So a couple of years ago, a man called Peter Boggis died at the age of 91 at a small hamlet called Easton Bavance in Suffolk, which is one of those lovely names for English places, which I presume meant something at one point. But it's this tiny, tiny collection of houses a few miles north of Sizewell, actually, which is, another place well known to the pod. And this place has been slowly eaten away by coastal erosion over the years. So you end up with the little collection of houses which are perched on top of some cliffs. And the cliffs are absolutely famous for fossil hunting. Basically, as the sea's coming in and eroding them, all these fossils are just kind of falling down from the cliff face, and collectors go there and pick them off the beach, and everyone has a great time. So in 2006, around the time they were created, Natural England declared this beach in this area a site of special scientific interest, an SSSI. Now, meanwhile, Boggis wants to stop his home and the homes of his neighbours from falling into the sea because this cliff is slowly working its way backwards across the land. And he's lived there since the 1930s, so he's been a resident there for 70 years. And whereas most people, obviously, if your house is about to fall into the sea, it's a bad day and there's probably not much you can do about it. Maybe send out a tweet or something. It turns out he's a retired agricultural engineer, which is like the perfect ex-career to deal with this problem. So he brings in 250,000 tons of clay soil and basically builds his own sea defenses to protect his community, like, as you do. It sort of sounds like a really extreme thing, but actually, if you look at pictures of it, it doesn't look like a horrendous pile of dirt. It sort of blends in with the beach and the landscape, and effectively he becomes regarded as this kind of modern-day King Canute, holding back the waves and protecting the coastline of England. He's like a local hero.
I was going to say, this sounds like quite an inspirational story, Martin. So Natural England, they heard this, and I'm guessing they were pleased because he was there protecting the coastline and protecting all of those fossils from the sea.
So you would think so, but actually they sued him.
Oh.
And basically what they said was that the erosion of the cliffs is somehow scientifically important because of all of these fossils. And they basically said that he was interfering with the natural process of Britain's coastline eroding. And so they took him to court. Now, luckily, he fought them and he won in a famous judgment. And the judge basically said, look, you can't just declare something a site of special scientific interest and then just say, hey, if you're a resident there and you need to fix your home, you can't anymore. And if you need to stop your house falling into the sea, tough luck. So he lost the case.
So Natural England, they're famous for trying to protect, jumping spiders and declaring SSSIs to do that. But now they're trying to protect animals that aren't even alive?
Yeah, it's the sort of natural extension, I guess. If you've run out of animals to complain about, let's start with extinct animals and see if we can protect their actual fossils. And to be clear, I'm not even sure how their mandate extended to fossils in the first place. It's incredibly vague. But essentially, they're coming to the position that fossils are more important than people or people's homes falling into the sea. And that's the tone, this kind of Skynet vibe that's continued through to this day.
So that's Natural England, Martin. So what does this have to do with West Sussex? Because, like you said, they're under occupation.
Yeah, so I mean, the good news is that West Sussex is not about to fall into the English Channel, but I'd encourage people to read Michael Denez's Substack. He goes into it in much more detail than we will here, and we'll post a link in the show notes at abundancepod.com where you can also subscribe. But essentially, Natural England want to protect a population of ram's horn snails in the Arun Valley in Sussex. Now, these are a rare, tiny, tiny snail. They're in various sites across the UK. They're also famous because a road in Norfolk has had improvements to it blocked for over a decade because of studies on the same species of snail happening in the area. And now the Arun Valley, it's a beautiful English kind of quintessential countryside river valley. It's a special conservation area. There's no chance of anyone building there, which is absolutely fine. Like, nobody would quibble with that valley being protected or the snails there being protected. It's a spectacular wildlife habitat. Great that it's being looked after. However, the valley is a river valley. And do you know what's important for rivers, James?
I'm guessing water, Martin.
Exactly. If you don't have water, you no longer have a river. So you need to make sure that the water doesn't dry out. Now, Natural England basically came to the position that the entire area that drains into this river and this valley is important for the preservation of that river in the future. And so even though they're not necessarily sure what the impact of things in that area would be, they want to make sure that there's no change at all, because if there is a change, it might affect the viability of the river and therefore the snails in the future. Now, this drainage area is basically the entire northern half of West Sussex. It goes all the way from like Petersfield on the A3, just north of Portsmouth, right the way across to Gatwick Airport and Crawley and the border with Surrey and East Sussex and Kent. It's called the Sussex North Water Supply Zone, which is a catchy name, and it covers an area of roughly 350 square miles. Now, There are something like 3 or 4 councils in that area, and in 2021, Natural England sent an extraordinary letter to them, which said, by the way, you can't develop on this land if it leads to so much as a thimbleful of extra water being used by these developments.
Martin, this is breaking my brain. This is insane. I didn't realize this weird little government organization was so madly powerful. I mean, it's taking me back to like geography lessons at school and drawing, maps of Oxbow lakes and watersheds and trying to colour them in. But 350 miles, and they said no of this whole area that you can't build on because of this one thing.
Exactly. And of course, like, how do you even build a house that doesn't use water? So it's almost like a veto on development. Now, Natural England would argue that they've set out some suggestions. So they say basically, well, every new build should have things like rainwater harvesting and grey water reuse to keep water usage as low as possible, like use as much from the rain as you can, recycle as much as you can. Now, straight away, that's adding a massive amount to the cost of a new house. So you're talking maybe several thousands of pounds worth of additional features and technology that you've got to build into the house. But even after you've installed all of that, the house is still going to need a water supply. It's still going to need fresh drinking water and so on. So developers or councils would then have to offset that by retrofitting existing commercial premises or houses with the same technology for even more thousands of pounds.
So if you wanted to build, say, I don't know, 20,000 houses, you'd have to find another 20,000 homes to retrofit to try and balance out the water use?
Well, it's even worse than that, because ultimately you would probably need to retrofit lots of houses for each house that needs to now have like net zero water usage. So potentially, you're talking several thousands of pounds per house, tens of thousands of houses. This is like hundreds of millions of pounds of added cost for one large development, plus all of the logistics, the time, the planning. Like, where do you even find all of the people to build these water recycling systems? Where do you get the labor from? Is the supply chain even big enough to do this? But the best part of all of this, James, is this is not like fixed policy that Natural England were providing. They're just interim suggestions. And basically, the letter goes on to say, hey, we're working on a larger strategy for like water management in the area. So our suggestion is that actually the best thing to do is just to stop making decisions on any planning applications whatsoever until we've done that strategy work at, sometime in the future, I guess.
Oh my God, this reminds me of this is a weird analogy, but you know how like a lot of left-wing people will go, well, to solve whatever problem is, first we must dismantle capitalism. It's a bit like that,
Yeah.
but like the Shire Tory version of that. Before we can build a single house, we've got to do all this basically insane stuff.
Yeah, exactly. To all intents and purposes, it's basically an attempt to ban any kind of development in the entire region that's been issued by basically just a single letter from some random bureaucrat. And what we're seeing here with water, and what Michael Denez found here, it turns out when I looked into this a bit further, it's not an isolated incident. It's actually part of a much wider trend across the country. So Simon Ricketts, who's a planning lawyer and blogger, he has a fantastic blog up I think it's called Simonicity, which we can add a link to as well in the show notes. He's described these things as development embargoes. And now Natural England and others will insist that this isn't the case. It's not really an embargo. It's not technically a ban, but it has effectively the same consequence, which is just to ban new development in an entire region. Now, in the case of Sussex, the case that Michael found, this example is about water levels and the drainage into that river. But vast areas of Hampshire, Cornwall, Dorset, other countries along the south coast and up in the north as well, have seen these embargoes put in place around nutrients. So essentially, wherever additional houses or changes to agricultural usage might cause more runoff or more sewage that could ultimately impact rivers, Natural England has written to those authorities and said, again, you just need to stop all development in these areas kind of until we say so. And to give you some context of the scale of this, in 2022, so the year after the letter that Michael spotted, something like 74 planning authorities were placed under these embargoes, the entire length and breadth of Britain. Probably talking about, I would guess, like 10 to 15% of the entire country.
Yeah, I was going to say, where the hell can we actually build stuff if all of this stuff is taken seriously? Where's left? Is there like a car park in Kettering or something, which I don't understand? Where the hell?
But even then you couldn't, because nobody drinks water from a car park, and if there's any change in the water usage. So yeah, even if you had like a multi-story car park and you said we want to tear it down and build a park, like that would be banned because a park would use more water and cause more runoff if it had toilets in it or something. So it's an insane, like, sweeping kind of dictation that they've made here. And, essentially that has obviously tanked house building in these areas. Not only can developers not build the houses, they don't even have a timeline for when any planning decision could even happen. Now, the reason this has come up in the news recently is because Rachel Reeves had apparently been in talks with a developer in West Sussex who was trying to do exactly what we've just talked about. They wanted to build 20,000 new homes there, which is obviously in keeping with the policy of the government that we've just elected. And they basically went to Rachel Reeves and talked about this, and she has essentially come down and overruled the embargo, which of course is what the last Tory government could have done if they weren't, all fighting each other the whole time.
It's a bit like the Steve Reed situation with the Cambridge sewage works, because there was sort of a bureaucratic process that led to this bad outcome. And then, politicians just need to learn, oh no, you can actually overrule stuff. You can make political decisions. you can take a political risk because you're a politician and didn't decide to actually do stuff for the greater good, I guess. But anyway, Martin, so how did Natural England have the power to do this in the first place, just to unilaterally stop development in an entire region like this? This seems a bit crazy to me.
Yeah, I mean, that is the question. And it's, I think, a little bit of an open question. Like, do they actually have the power to do this? Or are they just making threats and throwing their weight around? And that works until someone bigger and badder comes in and puts a stop to it. Now, somewhat ironically, in the letter, they actually reference European case law as justification for what they're doing. Now, some of our sharper listeners, James, will know that we left the European Union back in 2016, but essentially a lot of this stuff was kind of waved through as part of that mad scramble to align Britain's regulatory policy and replace all of the EU-dependent legislation that was removed and make sure our laws still make sense. And so we've ended up kind of stuck with it. And I do, I'm not a big party political person, as you know, James, but I do find it slightly hilarious that you've got the sort of arch Remainer scourge of the right, Rachel Reeves, who's tearing up the European red tape and saying, get on with it. If I wanted to troll essentially everybody listening to the podcast, I'd say it's quite a Thatcherite move, James, but you can decide if you think that's a good thing or not.
I was going to say, Martin, you know that I would be the last Remainer in the jungle fighting the war long after it's long become irrelevant. But it does sound like, have we just found a benefit of Brexit?
I mean, but perhaps so, James. We'll put it on the big list that we're keeping. But I think it's a case that is worth highlighting, even though it's kind of resolved now, at least in this instance, because it's just such an extraordinary example of, this organization, this bureaucracy that was set up with incredibly noble aims. Like, we want to protect the environment, but it's turned into this kind of mad anti-democratic monster that's just sort of ordering local councils around, declaring that it has complete control over vast swathes of British territory. It's honestly the kind of behavior you'd expect from the heyday of the East India Company or something, right? Like bureaucrats in helmets strutting around and pointing at bits of hillside and like making sweeping declarations about who's allowed to be there and what you can do. And how is it possible that one tiny, tiny public body like can just effectively ban construction across vast areas of the country, and there's just no scrutiny to it? There's no like parliamentary oversight. It's just, well, I woke up this morning and I sent a letter and now that's banned for like Sussex. Like, how do they have that power?
Martin, I love that you're talking up like this invading force, because I've no idea what the Natural England office is like, but I bet it's sort of a fairly dowdy normal government office with peeling wallpaper and coffee cups piled up in the sink and so on. But yeah, it does seem weirdly powerful. But Martin, are we absolutely sure? Because you've railed against Natural England for the past however many minutes, and every week you're slagging them off. Are we sure you don't just hate the environment?
No. Like, I love driving my sports car through the environment on a regular basis, and like, as with so many of these topics, none of this, I think, is about whether you think the environment should be protected or not. It's not even about the ram's horn snail or the particular bats that we've talked about with the bat tunnel. Nobody disputes that the Arun Valley is a spectacular natural asset and it's something that we should be protecting. And it's really good that we've got a public body that is concerned about rivers and pollution and that is holding developers accountable and working with local authorities to try to make sure that those protections are in place. But in a way, that's not what Natural England are doing. It's almost like they've been given complete dictatorial power. And rather than using that to actually work with local authorities or work with developers towards some kind of common goal, it's turned into almost like the Spanish Inquisition or the Handmaid's Tale or something. Like, you almost imagine these people just turning up with like hooded robes and ceremonial maces and issuing doctrine to terrified bureaucrats like cowering under their desks. And like, none of this, like, it's toxic. Like, it fundamentally, like, the whole culture around this just seems completely toxic. There's no sense of like working towards a common goal or that we're trying to achieve the same things. It's just like, well, we have the power, so we're going to stamp on you until you fall into submission. And if there are massive consequences of that for the economy or for people's lives or for county councils, we just don't care. Like, it's not our problem. And it's just a disgraceful attitude for a public body to have. And honestly, I think one of the best things Labour could do for this situation, but for the environment generally, is tear up the whole thing, rebuild it into something that's much more aligned with that national interest of like, we want to progress, we want to develop, and we want to bring the environment with us and protect that along the way. Because ultimately, if you care about the environment, and I'm sorry to come back to this point yet again on this podcast, not addressing this stuff is the biggest risk. Because if Labour don't do it, Reform are going to come in. And do you think they're going to care about an organisation like Natural England? Do you think they're going to set it up in a way that's going to provide these protections? It is going to take one pen stroke for Farage or whoever he appoints to disband this organisation completely. And then you have none of those protections. And that's a really terrible position to end up in. And I think if we do end up in that position, Natural England themselves are going to bear a lot of the blame for it. End of rants.
I was going to say, I don't think I can top that. I think that's just the end of the segment.
And if you'd like to hear more impassioned rants against Natural England, then don't forget to like and subscribe.
I was going to say, I think you can hear previous Natural England coverage on episodes. Let me think. 1, 2, 3, 4. Basically, we slag them off every week. So if you've enjoyed that, you'll enjoy the rest of the show.
Exactly. And for every new follower or subscriber on your favorite podcast app, we will stamp on one ramshorn snail. No, we won't really. We love snails. I mean, I don't mind snails. I wouldn't invite them into the house, but it's a good thing that they exist. And yeah. Next thing, James. Let's move on.